What would you do if the only thing you could afford in the whole world was a ruin? Picture it, 18 years old, nothing but the clothes on your back and the last of your father's wages clutched tight in your hand. You are offered a choice, the open road or a place so thoroughly despised, so deeply feared that its deed was worth less than a new pair of boots. This was the choice facing Emma Barrett. She spent 15 shillings on a property the village of Coalbridge swore was haunted, a place known as Hollow Cross, sitting dead at the forgotten far end of Sedgwick Lane. The solicitor actually laughed as she signed her name. But the truth waiting inside that house, sealed away from the sunlight for nearly a century, was not a ghost at all. It was a promise. It all began on a damp autumn morning in 1862. A discarded girl and a discarded house somehow finding a purpose in each other. The journey to Coalbridge had leached the very last of the warmth from Emma Barrett's bones. She had ridden for 2 days on the back of a carter's wagon. Her small bundle of possessions sat wrapped in an oilskin cloth right beside her. The constant jolting of the wagon wheels became a dull ache, one that perfectly matched the ache in her chest. Ever since her father's passing a month prior, the world had been a grim procession of gray skies and cold shoulders. The tied cottage they once called home was gone. The foreman had given her exactly 3 days to clear out, his face set in a mask of practiced pity. She had worked since she was old enough to hold a needle, her fingers rubbed raw from mending. Yet there was simply no place for a solitary girl with zero family to speak for her. All she had left was one final envelope of pay, a worn silver locket holding a strand of her mother's hair, and a rather curious letter her father had pressed into her palm during his last fevered hours. It was addressed to a solicitor in this very village. As the cart rumbled over the stone bridge marking the entrance to Coalbridge, Emma felt the heavy weight of watching eyes. Faces peered from the windows of the butcher shop and the bakery, expressions caught somewhere between quiet curiosity and deep suspicion. A stranger was an event. A young woman traveling completely alone was a story already being written by everybody else. The carter, a kindly man named Mr. Giles with a face weathered like old leather, finally pulled his horses to a halt. They stopped outside a narrow building. Davies and Sons solicitor sat painted in faded gold leaf on the glass. "This is the place, miss," he told her, keeping his voice low. "Are you quite certain you will be all right?" Emma just nodded. She could not summon the words for a proper thank you. She handed him one of her few remaining shillings. It was an amount he tried to refuse, but she firmly insisted. He watched as she slid down from the cart, her mended boots landing softly on the damp cobbles. He saw the deep fatigue in her pale face, but there was also a stubborn line to her jaw, hinting at a raw strength she had not yet measured. He tipped his hat and murmured for God to go with her. With a sharp click of his tongue, the wagon groaned onward, leaving her utterly alone. The street was narrow. The tall buildings leaned in together as if sharing secrets. The cold air smelled heavily of coal smoke and wet earth. For a brief moment, her resolve wavered. The memory of her father's hand, thin and fever-hot inside her own, was a sudden sharp pain. "Go to Davies," he had whispered, his voice nothing but a dry rasp. "He holds a debt. It is not much, but it is something. A roof, Emma. A place to stand." She took a deep, shaky breath, letting the cold air sting her lungs, and pushed open the heavy oak door to the solicitor's office. A tiny bell tinkled somewhere inside the dim interior. It announced the arrival of a girl who had absolutely nothing left to lose. She was homeless, adrift. About to make a bargain the whole village would call pure foolishness, but her father had always taught her that the world's opinion was just a shifting wind. The earth beneath your feet, though. That was a truth you could actually depend on. She just needed to find her patch of earth. The solicitor's office was a cramped, suffocating space. It smelled of dry paper, old sealing wax, and the slow decay of legal precedent. Wooden shelves bowed heavily under the weight of leather-bound ledgers. A weak November light struggled to push through a dusty window. A clerk with a perpetually worried expression peered at her over his spectacles, then vanished into a back room. Emma stood waiting, clutching her bundle tight. She felt acutely aware of the damp hem of her dress and her badly worn cloak. But she was not the only visitor. A large, florid man with heavy mutton-chop whiskers stood warming his back by the small coal fire. His thick tweed coat strained hard at its buttons. He regarded her with an air of total dismissive authority. His cold gaze swept over her like she was just a piece of misplaced furniture. This was Squire Thorne. A man whose ownership of half the county was boldly announced in every single gesture. Mr. Davies finally emerged, a thin, harried man who looked to be swimming in a suit several sizes too large. "Miss Barrett," he asked, rubbing his tired eyes, "I received your letter of introduction." He gestured to a hard wooden chair, but before she could even sit, Squire Thorne cleared his throat. It sounded exactly like gravel being shoveled. "Davies," he boomed, "we were just concluding the matter of the old Hollow Cross property. Since the land adjoins my own and the taxes are a full decade in arrears, I'm prepared to take it right off the parish's hands. A public service, really. The place is a total blight." Mr. Davies physically flinched. "Yes, Squire, but as to that, Miss Barrett's father, a Mr. Thomas Barrett, held a note against the property's previous owner. Just a small matter of a loan that was never repaid. The estate agreed it could be settled with the deed itself should the debt ever be called in." The squire turned his full heavy attention to Emma. A cruel smirk played on his lips. "The girl wants that absolute wreck that haunted ruin on Sedgwick Lane. What would you do with it, child? Frighten the local crows." Emma's face remained entirely impassive, though a slow heat burned in her cheeks. She looked not at the squire, but straight at the solicitor. "My father said it was a roof," she told them, her voice perfectly quiet but clear. "I have need of one." Mr. Davies let out a heavy sigh, shuffling papers across his desk. "The deed can certainly be signed over to you, Miss Barrett, but the transfer requires a settlement fee for the legal paperwork. 15 shillings. Emma felt a freezing cold knot tighten in her stomach. It was almost everything she had left. 15 shillings for a place everyone called a ruin. The squire let out a short, barking laugh. 15 shillings for a pile of rotten timber and ghosts. Take her money, Davies, and let her have her little folly. It will provide the village with some much-needed amusement." Emma untied the small cloth purse from her belt. She carefully counted out the coins, her very last worldly wealth, right onto the solicitor's desk. The copper and silver shone dully in the dim gloom. She took the offered quill. The feather tickled her badly worn cuff. She signed her name, Emma Barrett, in the clear, steady hand her father had taught her. As she finished the final stroke, Squire Thorne laughed all over again. A loud, booming sound that filled up the tiny office. He shook his head, chuckling to himself like he had just witnessed the finest joke of the season. "Well done, girl," he told her. It was not unkind, but carried the deep, unshakable contempt of a man who had never known a single day of want. "You have just purchased the most expensive pile of firewood in the entire county. Was it pure foolishness that drove her? A desperate grasp at the only single option left? Or did some deeper, much quieter instinct whisper to her that a place so thoroughly dismissed by the world might actually hold a secret value? What really guides a person in a moment like that? Is it cold, calculated reason, or a feeling that runs far deeper than common sense? Perhaps it is simply about finding quiet courage when the world demands you surrender. Because, as Emma stepped out into the rain clutching a deed that felt heavy as a tombstone, yet light as a feather, the real story of Hollow Cross House was truly just beginning. Holding that stiff parchment tight, she walked out of the solicitor's office and straight back into the thin, persistent drizzle of Coalbridge. The warmth of the squire's fire was already a distant memory. It was quickly replaced by a damp chill that seemed to seep right from the very stones of the village. As she made her way towards the market square, she felt the heavy, renewed weight of observation. Her transaction inside that solicitor's office had not been a private affair. In a place exactly like Coalbridge, news traveled so much faster than a horse and cart. It was carried on whispers and meaningful glances. A woman in a heavy baker's apron paused her sweeping to stare. Two men unloading barrels from a dray wagon stopped their work entirely. They nudged one another, muttering something lost in the rumble of wheels. But the meaning was perfectly clear in their smirking faces. The story was already taking its shape. The orphan girl, the mad purchase, the haunted house. Suddenly a carriage rattled right past her, its thick wheels spraying muddy water. Inside sat Squire Thorne, his large frame filling the leather seat. He saw her, and instead of just looking away, he leaned right towards the window and rapped on the glass. The driver immediately pulled the horses to a halt. The squire lowered the window, his face ruddy and deeply condescending. "A word of advice, girl," he called out, his booming voice carrying easily across the street. "When the harsh winter winds begin blowing through the holes in your new roof, you will find my barns are quite dry. I'm always in need of cheap labor." He did not even wait for a reply. He tapped the roof of the carriage, and it lurched heavily forward, leaving Emma standing in a cloud of its owner's immense self-satisfaction. She said nothing. She simply pulled her thin cloak tighter and kept walking. Her gaze locked dead on the road ahead. Her father always said a quiet tongue answered a loud fool, but she turned away from the main square, taking a narrower lane toward the village edge. There, near the parish churchyard, sat an old woman on a stone bench. A heavy woolen shawl covered her hunched shoulders, her face nothing but a deep map of wrinkles. She sat as still as the ancient yew trees behind her. Emma would have walked right past without a single thought. But as she drew level, the old woman spoke. Her voice sounded thin and reedy, like the dry rustle of dead leaves. "Some walls are built to keep things in, not out," she murmured. Her gaze never met Emma, staying fixed on the gray, shifting clouds overhead. The words were so strange and sudden that Emma stopped dead in her tracks. She studied the old woman known locally as Widow Hemlock, a figure of very few words and a very long memory. The widow refused to look back. She just kept staring at the sky as though she were merely talking about the weather. Unsure what to make of this cryptic warning, Emma offered a slight hesitant nod and kept walking. Those words followed her anyway. They settled in her mind like a burr caught on a woolen stocking, meaningless yet entirely impossible to shake loose. What could a wall possibly keep in? She thought of prisons. She thought of asylums. She thought of tombs. That dark image did little to lighten her heavy heart as she finally spotted the weathered signpost for Sedgwick Lane. The path itself was barely a road, feeling more like a mere suggestion. Branching off the main village track, it quickly devolved into a thin ribbon of mud and stone. Overgrown hedgerows, thick with thorn and ivy, hemmed her in on both sides. The farther down she walked, the more the village noises faded away. Soon she heard only water dripping from bare branches and the lonely cry of a distant crow. The damp air grew colder and noticeably heavier. After nearly a mile, the lane curved sharply. There, through a dead grove of silver birch trees, she finally saw it. Hollow Cross House. It stood on a slight rise, an imposing silhouette against the bruised sky. And the sight was worse, far worse than the squire had led her to imagine with his cruel mockery. This was not a house. It was the literal ghost of a house. The roof sagged deeply in the middle like a broken spine, missing slates and jagged, rotting patches. Most windows were boarded over with gray, weathered planks. The few that remained open looked like dark, vacant eyes. Their glass shattered long ago. A massive wave of thick ivy had entirely consumed the eastern wall. Those thick, hairy tendrils pried at the ancient mortar and crawled over the sills. The garden had become a wild tangle of briars and weeds. Out here, nature was not simply reclaiming the abandoned land, but actively burying it. A profound silence hung heavily over the entire property. This stillness felt ancient, almost watchful. The rain had finally eased into a mist, clinging to the old estate in a soft gray shroud. Emma felt her stomach drop. The squire had been completely right. She had purchased nothing but ruined firewood. Those 15 shillings, her entire life fortune, felt like a fool's bitter payment for a useless heap of stones. She forced herself up the overgrown path toward the front door, a heavy oak barrier studded with rusted iron. A tarnished brass knocker shaped like a raven's head sat frozen in place. She pushed hard, but the swollen wood remained completely wedged inside its frame. Giving up, she worked her way around the side of the building, tearing through wet ferns and thick brambles that snagged fiercely at her skirt. Then she found a small, low window with a rotted frame. It seemed to lead straight into an old pantry. One of the covering boards felt slightly loose. With some desperate effort, she wrenched it away. The gap was narrow, but she was thin enough. Taking a deep breath of the damp, musty air breathing out from the interior, she hitched up her skirts. She shoved her bundle through the gap and climbed inside, leaving the gray, judging world firmly behind. The darkness in there was absolute. It was a thick, palpable blackness that smelled of rot dust and something else entirely. The deep, freezing scent of a place long unloved. That night, without a single candle or a fire, she swept a small patch of the stone kitchen floor using a broken branch. She laid down her cloak curled up tight and used her bundle as a rough pillow. Drifting into a highly uneasy sleep, she remained completely unaware of the green eyes watching her from the deep scullery shadows, a silent feline witness to her grim arrival. Above her, the old historic property groaned loudly, settling around her fragile form, its ancient bones whispering quiet secrets she could not possibly understand yet. Those first few days at Hollow Cross House were a brutal battle against dampness and total despair. Emma woke every single morning to a bone-deep chill. The gray light filtering through the grimy pantry glass became her only clock. Her immediate priority was basic survival. She found an old bucket in the scullery, using it to haul water from a mossy well in the back garden. The water tasted incredibly cold and clear, leaving a sharp mineral tang. She had a small loaf of bread and a solid wedge of hard cheese purchased with her last few pennies. She rationed them without mercy. Soon she discovered a small cast-iron stove in the kitchen that was actually sound. Its flue was heavily choked with dead leaves and bird nests, but not broken. She spent a whole day clearing it out. By sunset, her hands and face were completely black with soot. That evening, using the flint and steel from her bundle along with dry twigs gathered beneath the yew trees, she finally coaxed a tiny precious fire to life. It was a rather small victory, but it felt monumental. That flickering orange light pushed back the oppressive darkness, offering a fragile bubble of real warmth inside the cavernous, freezing kitchen. It was on the second night, as she sat huddled close to the hot stove, that her silent observer finally made itself known. A terribly thin black cat with startlingly green eyes and a torn ear crept out from the shadows. It moved with a slow, wary grace. Its ribs showed starkly beneath a dusty coat. It never approached her, choosing instead to sit by the far wall, just watching the flames. Emma broke off a tiny crumb of her cheese, sliding it gently across the rough stone floor. The cat stared at it for a long moment. Then it darted forward, snatched the morsel, and retreated back into the heavy darkness to devour it. Right there, an unspoken truce was formed. She decided to name him Soot, honoring his color and their shared hearth. From then on, he became her constant, silent companion, a tiny living presence inside that vast, dead house. Now, with a source of heat and water secured, Emma began the real work, reclaiming the property from decades of total neglect. She started right in the kitchen. It was a cavernous room, its heavy flagstone floor slick with a fine, creeping green mold. Retrieving a worn broom and a stiff scrubbing brush from a collapsing outbuilding, she immediately set to work. The physical labor was absolutely grueling. Her back and arms ached violently with the effort, yet with every single stone she scrubbed clean, she felt she was washing away a deep layer of the house's sorrow along with her own. Days quickly blurred into a steady rhythm of work and brief rest. She unboarded the windows in the kitchen and the main hall. Shafts of dusty, watery sunlight pierced the gloom for the first time in decades. That light illuminated the true extent of the decay, severely peeling wallpaper, hanging cobwebs as thick as heavy cotton shrouds, and a pervasive layer of gray dust coating absolutely everything. And yet it also revealed the home's good bones. The incredibly solid oak beams, the deep, sturdy stone hearths, the elegant curving arch of the doorways. It was during this systematic cleaning process, moving from the hall into the back parlor, that she first noticed a strange anomaly. The parlor was a massive square room that surely used to be beautiful. It faced the overgrown back garden, featuring two tall, arched windows flanking a marble fireplace. Its ornate mantelpiece was utterly choked with dried leaves that had drifted down the open chimney. The entire room was perfectly symmetrical, a true study in formal balance. Well, except for one glaring detail. The wall just left of the fireplace looked completely different. The other walls were constructed of traditional lath and plaster. Over the years, they had developed a gentle, undulating wave, a slight, very human unevenness, hinting at their vast age. But this one specific section of wall, stretching from the fireplace to the corner, sat perfectly, unnervingly flat. When she ran her bare hand over the surface, it felt colder, harder, and much more solid. She tapped the spot with her knuckles. While the other walls offered a hollow, resonant echo, this one returned a dull, dense thud. It was just a small thing, a minor detail most would easily overlook. But in the deep, heavy quiet of that house, every creak and groan served as a word in a language she was slowly learning. And this discordant note rang out loudly. She leaned in close, her eyes tracing the flat surface. Down near the skirting board, almost completely hidden in the shadows, she spotted a faint hairline crack in the thick plaster. A tiny seam ran vertically for just a few inches before vanishing entirely. Then she realized something else. Soot, who usually dozed right in front of the fire, would frequently wander to that side of the room. He would sit staring intently at that exact spot on the wall, watching something she could not even see. The mystery of that parlor wall, quickly became a quiet obsession, a strange puzzle mulled over during long, painful hours of physical toil. Emma did not act on it immediately, though. She had far more pressing concerns to handle. A bad leak in the roof above the main staircase created a persistent drip threatening to completely rot the magnificent oak banister. She spent 3 arduous days clambering over the treacherous moss-slicked roof, using salvaged slates from a collapsed shed to carefully patch the hole. The work was incredibly dangerous and exhausting, leaving her hands badly torn and her fragile body bruised. But when the next rainstorm hit, the wooden floor below remained completely dry. The victory felt absolutely immense. She was not merely fixing a house anymore. She was healing it. Each mended slate and scrubbed floorboard became a genuine act of faith. She was learning the anatomy of the building, its core strengths, hidden weaknesses, and its many sighs and whispers. Soot remained her constant shadow throughout all of it. Whenever she worked in the overgrown garden, cutting back the thick briars, choking the stone paths, he would sit proudly on the wall, just watching. When she knelt to scrub floors, he curled up right out of reach of the soapy water. His loud purr became a low, rumbling counterpoint to the harsh scrape of her brush. Her hands, once soft from needlework, were now hard and calloused. She was thinner than when she arrived, but her arms and shoulders felt newly strong. The labor was changing her, hammering out a resilience she never knew she had. She originally came to Hollowcross just seeking shelter, a quiet place to simply exist. And yet, by tending to the bones of this derelict house, she was somehow managing to repair herself. That heavy loneliness, a constant shadow since her father died, finally began to pull back, replaced by sheer purpose. The house was her patient, her charge, and she was its faithful steward. One afternoon, after the quiet meal of boiled potatoes, she stepped back into the rear parlor with her broom. The low autumn sun cut through the freshly scrubbed glass, catching thick clouds of dust dancing in the dead air. Her eyes drifted straight back to that flat, silent wall. The nagging sense that something was wrong, that it simply did not belong here, felt heavier than ever. The widow's warning echoed in her head. Some walls are built to keep things trapped inside rather than keeping them out. She dropped the broom. Her pulse picked up. Walking to the kitchen hearth, she grabbed the heavy iron poker. Its solid weight felt incredibly serious in her grip. Back in the parlor, she dropped to her knees, staring dead ahead at a faint, unnatural seam running right along the floorboards. Soot padded over, rubbing his dark head against her arm before sitting to watch, his green eyes wide and curious. Using the sharp tip of the poker, Emma carefully probed the crack. A tiny chunk of plaster flaked away, dropping completely silently onto the bare wood. Underneath, there was no pale wooden lath, just the dark, rough red of solid brick. Her breath caught tight in her throat. She kept working, slow, deliberate, chipping away layer after layer of the crumbling white plaster. These bricks were laid tight and perfect. The mortar was incredibly smooth, totally unlike the crude stone of the fireplace in the cellar. This was a master's craft, and it was undeniably much newer than the bones of the old house. For the next 2 days, she painstakingly scraped away every last bit of plaster. It exposed a flawless rectangle of brick, maybe 4 feet wide and climbing 6 feet high. A doorway. A completely sealed, hidden entrance, cleverly disguised to look just like an ordinary wall. No iron handle, no brass keyhole, absolutely nothing to show it could even be opened. It was a pure statement of finality, built to stay sealed until the end of time. But they hadn't counted on a girl with nothing left to lose and endless hours to study the details. The heavy brick kept its silence. Emma ran her bare fingers over the cold, rough clay, tracing those impossibly precise lines of mortar. It was a perfect, seamless block, a puzzle lacking any clear answer. For days, she simply sat there staring, desperate to understand what it meant. Why go to such extreme lengths? Were they trying to bury something priceless in there, or something genuinely awful? Those village rumors about ghosts drifted back, and for the very first time, real fear crept in. But this house had given her nothing but warmth and shelter. It never once hurt her. Her gut said this wasn't a burial tomb, it was a vault. She started testing the bricks, pressing them, tapping each block with her iron poker and listening closely for any shift in pitch. Most were dead solid. But right near the center, at about waist height, a single brick seemed to give just a fraction under the heavy iron. Just a tiny shift, almost invisible. She zeroed in right there, using the jagged edge of an old broken trowel to meticulously scrape out the dried mortar surrounding that one specific block. The old mortar wasn't nearly as tough as modern cement crumbling fast into a fine, pale dust. It took hours of agonizing finger-cramping labor. Eventually, though, the brick rattled loose in its socket. Wedging the poker in deep as a lever, she pried the block completely free. It scraped out with a low grind, leaving a pitch-black rectangular hole. A rush of cold, dead air immediately washed across her face. It didn't stink of rot or decay, though. It was dry, earthy, smelling exactly like a deep cellar filled with old paper and bundles of dried herbs. The fear vanished, swallowed entirely by a sudden burning curiosity. Grabbing her only candle, she lit the wick, cupping the flame with one hand before holding it straight to the gap. The flickering light pushed the darkness back. It wasn't a room at all. Just a small, brick-lined cavity barely an arm's length deep. An alcove, a perfectly engineered hiding spot. Inside, sitting squarely on a thick oak shelf, was a black tin deed box. Right underneath, stacked in a neat row, lay 5 heavy leather-bound journals. Her heart slammed violently against her ribs. Hands shaking, she reached into the dark and pulled out the top journal. The leather felt bone-dry, yet oddly soft. No name stamped anywhere on the cover. Setting it down, she hauled out the tin deed box. It was heavy, unbelievably solid. She assumed it would be locked tight, but when she pressed the metal clasp, it gave way with a sharp click. Inside, resting on faded red velvet, she didn't find jewels or coins. Instead, she found rolled parchments tied with silk ribbon bundles of wax-sealed letters and a separate will penned on thick, heavy paper. She carefully unrolled a parchment. It was an incredibly complex architectural draft plans for a massive glass greenhouse far more intricate and beautiful than anything she knew. Then she unfolded the will. The document was dated 1805, signed by Silas Thorne, a name completely unknown to her. It bequeathed Hollow Cross House and everything inside not to his blood relatives, but to whoever proved a patient steward to the land and a true friend to growing things. Next, she cracked open the journal. The ink was elegant and sharp. The very first page read, 1798. The man wrote that his brother, the local squire, thought his life's work was pure insanity. The brother only saw land for the shillings it could produce, entirely blind to the living library buried underneath. Silas noted that his brother called the seed collection an idiot's hobby. He never grasped that every single seed was a word, a fragile story of a specific place and time. Silas was terrified his family would burn the entire collection once he died. And so the journal continued. I have decided to give my library a stronger binding. A wall of heavy brick and total silence. A vault built not for gold, but for life itself. Emma sank back onto her heels, the weak candlelight washing over her wide, stunned eyes. This place was never haunted. It was a sanctuary. Silas Thorne wasn't some raving lunatic hiding in the dark. He was a visionary. He had literally walled up his entire life's work, a priceless library of rare ancient seeds, just to keep it safe from his greedy relatives. That same night, the sky finally tore open. A brutal storm that had been brewing for days slammed into Coalbridge with absolute fury. Cold winds shrieked through the eaves of Hollow Cross, violently shaking the window frames and testing every single patch Emma had made on the roof. The rain didn't fall in drops. It hit the house in heavy, solid walls of driving water. Safe by the warm flicker of the hearth fire, Emma sat alone at the kitchen table, reading through the scattered journals of Silas Thorne. She was completely hooked. Reading about his long treks across the English countryside, hunting down seeds from ancient meadows, overgrown orchards, and wild, empty moors. He was cataloging fragile plant species that were already disappearing even back then. He was a brilliant botanist, an artist, a quiet philosopher. Every page breathed a deep, humble respect for the wild earth, a feeling that mirrored her own silent thoughts perfectly. He even explained how the house itself was engineered for his grand experiment. The massive stone walls kept a steady chill. The deep dirt cellar was flawless for long storage, and the walled garden outside was his personal laboratory. Suddenly, a vicious gust of wind hit, followed by a massive grinding crash from the back of the property. Emma jumped, her heart flying into her throat. Soot shot up from the rug-back arch, totally on edge. Squinting hard through the rain-battered kitchen glass, she could barely see it. A massive chunk of the heavy stone garden wall had completely caved into the dirt lane. While fighting to tie down a shutter ripping loose in the wind, she caught a noise cutting through the gale. A human voice, just a thin, desperate scream for help before the roaring storm swallowed it whole. Without even thinking about the danger, Emma struck a match, lit a brass lantern, and threw a damp cloak over her head. She shoved her shoulder against the back door and stepped right into the freezing maelstrom. The crosswind nearly ripped the handle from her grip. The dirt lane was a rushing river of mud, and there, pitched sideways into the ditch with its back wheel shattered against her fallen garden wall, lay a small wooden cart. A lame horse stood freezing in the rain. Huddled right against its legs were three shaking figures, a man, a woman, and a tiny child. Emma screamed over the thunder, telling them to come inside. The man, pale and trembling from the bitter cold, just stared at her like she was a ghost. The man stammered about the house being cursed, but his wife, gripping their freezing son, was already running toward the lantern's glow. The mother begged for help, crying that her boy was soaked to the bone. Emma rushed them straight into the kitchen, a tiny glowing haven hidden from the roaring black storm. She stripped off their soaked coats and wrapped the shivering child in her only dry blanket. She stoked the fading fire, threw a kettle on to boil, and split her very last block of cheese and stale bread. The husband was a carter named John. He explained they were rushing for the next town when the sky broke, and in the pitch black they never even saw the collapsed stones. John kept scanning the kitchen, looking at the freshly scrubbed floorboards, the neat stack of old journals on the table. He looked totally bewildered. He whispered that everyone in the village swore this place was completely haunted. Cursed, he said. Emma looked from the terrified family to the open journal. A sudden wave of pure clarity hit her, sealing a quiet promise in her chest. She was the steward now. This was her watch. She looked back at John. "It isn't haunted," she answered softly, her voice steady and absolutely sure. It had just been waiting for her. She would protect this place, and whatever secrets it held, her choice was firmly made. With the dawn, the fierce storm finally broke, leaving a world completely washed clean and glistening. The sky was a fragile blue. The air smelled of wet earth. John the carter surveyed his broken wagon with a heavy heart, but his gratitude to Emma was immense. "We would have perished out there," he told her, his voice thick with heavy emotion. He had no idea how that they could ever repay her. Emma simply shook her head. They needed shelter, and the house provided it. John promised to return and repair the garden wall the moment his wagon was finally mended. He walked back into Coalbridge with his wife and son. The story he told wasn't about ghosts or ruin. It was about a quiet, resourceful girl in a warm kitchen, someone who had just saved his family from the storm. That tale spread through the village like absolute wildfire. Emma was no longer a figure of pity or ridicule. She was a mystery. People who had once mocked her purchase now spoke in hushed, curious tones. Everything had suddenly shifted. The real catalyst for this change was the sudden arrival of Mr. Davies, the local solicitor. Hearing the news and feeling a sharp pang of professional duty, he rode his horse straight out to Hollow Cross that very afternoon. He found Emma in the back parlor, carefully dusting the tin boxes pulled from the hidden alcove. She was no longer the timid, defeated girl from his office. Meeting his gaze directly, her expression remained calm and composed. She greeted him, her voice perfectly even. There was something he needed to see. Without a trace of triumph, she showed him everything. The bricked-up wall, the journals, the drawings, and the second will of Silas Thorne. The solicitor, not an easily impressed man, stood completely speechless. He took the will, hands trembling slightly as he examined the paper, the ink, and the wax seal. He instantly recognized the elegant script from older documents in his office. This was Silas Thorne's own hand. He murmured, his eyes wide. He spent the next hour poring over the journals, his skepticism giving way to profound respect. "A seed bank," he breathed. He created a private seed bank. The man was a genius, not a madman. He looked at Emma, a new understanding dawning in his tired eyes. "The will is perfectly clear, Miss Barrett, left to whosoever proves a patient steward." And that was her. Legally and morally, everything here was hers. News of the solicitor's ruling perfectly solidified Emma's new standing. The villagers, their curiosity piqued well beyond measure, began appearing at the very end of Sedgwick Lane. They didn't come to mock her. They came to stare in wonder at the old house they had avoided for so long. One afternoon, Squire Thorne's carriage suddenly appeared. He marched right up the path, his face a thunderous mask of indignation. He demanded to know what this nonsense was trying to aggressively push past her into the house. Whatever his great-uncle secreted away belongs to the Thorne estate. Emma didn't move a muscle. Framed in the doorway, she stood small but completely immovable. "No, sir." she said, her voice entirely devoid of anger or fear. "It belongs to the house, and I am its keeper." The squire sputtered, his face flushing a rather dangerous shade of purple. But right then Mr. Davies stepped forward from the hallway just behind Emma. "The will is fully legally binding, Squire," the solicitor stated calmly. He had already filed it with the local magistrate. Miss Barrett was the absolute legal owner of the property and its contents. Completely defeated and publicly humbled, for the very first time, Squire Thorne turned around. Without another word, he marched straight back to his carriage and rode away. The village watched him go, and in that very moment, the dark story of Hollow Cross was finally rewritten for good. Over the weeks that followed, a quiet sort of transformation took hold not just inside Emma, but across the entire community of Coalbridge. The tale of Silas Thorne's hidden library quickly captured the imagination of the entire county. Botanists from the Royal Horticultural Society traveled out to examine the collection. They confirmed it actually held seeds from several species long thought to be totally extinct. Its immense value wasn't about money, it was about heritage and deep science. The house was no longer some haunted ruin, it was a living seed library. The villagers, quietly shamed by their past scorn and truly inspired by Emma's steady tenacity, started showing up to help. Mr. Giles, the carter who first brought her to the village, appeared one afternoon with a heavy load of sound timber to repair the broken floors. And John, the father she rescued from that terrible storm, returned just as he had promised. Alongside 2 other men, he rebuilt the ruined garden wall stronger than it ever was before. The baker's wife, who once stared at her with cold suspicion, began bringing a fresh loaf of bread every single morning. They didn't come with pity anymore. They came with profound respect. They were no longer helping a lonely outcast. They were contributing to a shared, meaningful purpose. Emma accepted their help with a quiet, grateful dignity. She guided the daily work with a natural authority, one born not from giving commands, but from a deep, intuitive understanding of what the old house really needed. She laid out Silas's old drawings for the cold frames and garden trellises, and the village carpenter built them exactly to spec. That wildly overgrown garden was slowly tamed. Its tangled chaos was steadily shaped back into the ordered beauty Silas had envisioned a whole century before. Thick briars were finally cleared away to reveal the strong bones of a forgotten orchard. Rare, ancient varieties of herbs were found still growing wild along the weathered stone paths. Then, on one soft autumn evening, as the setting sun cast long golden shadows across the fresh lawn, Emma stood quietly in the doorway of the back parlor. The alcove was now fronted with a simple glass door. It protected the precious collection while leaving it entirely visible, a quiet tribute to its brilliant creator. Soot now, a wonderfully sleek and contented cat, rubbed gently against her leg, purring loudly. Mr. Davies stood beside her, a ledger resting in his hand. The final itemization of the seed collection for the official records was finally complete. Looking around at the peaceful, purposeful activity in the garden, he took in the restored house glowing in the warm evening light. Then he glanced at the remarkable young woman who had made it all possible. "You have done a truly remarkable thing here, Emma," he told her gently. "So what will you do now?" Emma watched quietly as the baker's young son carefully watered a row of newly planted seedlings. She looked out across the fertile land, gazing at the real community she had unknowingly built around one shared act of stewardship. A small, deeply peaceful smile finally touched her lips. "I thought I had just bought an old house," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "But instead I was given a garden to tend. Thank you for joining us for this beautiful story of quiet discovery. It's a gentle reminder that our greatest inheritance is so often a purpose rather than just a piece of property." If you were deeply moved by Emma's journey today, please leave a like and a comment, and be sure to subscribe for more incredible tales of hidden worth. We will see you again very soon.